The events of August 8, 2013 left the small neighborhood of South Miami Beach stunned. What seemed like a typical day would soon turn into one of the most disturbing and tragic stories of betrayal, violence, and manipulation the city had ever seen. The killing of Jennifer Alfonso by her husband, Derek Medina, was not a random act of violence. It was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of psychological abuse, manipulation, and a relationship that was fractured beyond repair. What made this case particularly chilling was the way it unfolded. Live on social media for the world to see. Jennifer Alfonso was just 26 years old when she was murdered by her 31-year-old husband. She had her whole life ahead of her, dreams of a career, a family, a future that would never come to fruition. But for Derek Medina, a man with a history of emotional volatility and a disturbing online presence, Jennifer's life would come to a tragic end in the home they once shared. And Derek, in a grotesque twist of irony, would turn to Facebook to share his confession to the world. It all began with a seemingly innocent evening. Jennifer and Derek had been married for several years. On the outside, they seemed like any other couple, attractive, outwardly happy, and living in a small but comfortable home in a desirable area of Miami Beach. But inside their home, things were anything but normal. A toxic dynamic had taken root, one characterized by controlling behavior, emotional manipulation, and a brewing storm that would eventually spill over into violence. Jennifer had confided in her friends and family about her troubled marriage. She had expressed concerns about Derek's behavior, his jealousy, his controlling tendencies, his inability to let go of arguments. He had become increasingly obsessed with her every move, constantly checking her phone, monitoring her social media, and questioning her every action. Jennifer, who had once been a bubbly and outgoing young woman, had started to withdraw, becoming quieter and more withdrawn as she tried to navigate the emotional minefield of her marriage. It was clear that the cracks in their relationship were widening. Yet, despite the obvious signs of emotional abuse, Jennifer tried to make it work. She loved Derek. She wanted to believe that things could get better. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She had tried to leave him before, but Derek would always beg her to stay. He promised that he would change. He promised that things would get better. And each time Jennifer returned, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that their love could overcome the darkness that had taken root in their marriage. But on that fateful night in August, it was too late. Derek Medina, a man who had a penchant for theatrics, would become the center of this tragic story in the most horrific way possible. He wasn't just any man. He was a man who had learned how to manipulate and control. Someone who had carefully crafted a public image for himself online. Derek was active on social media, sharing his thoughts, his opinions, and his life with his followers. But on that night, his online presence would take on a far more sinister tone. It started like any other evening. Jennifer and Derek had an argument that, by all accounts, wasn't particularly unusual. They had been arguing more frequently in recent months. Derek had been increasingly paranoid, suspicious, and controlling, while Jennifer had grown weary and desperate. On the evening of the murder, it was clear that something had finally snapped in Derek. Something deep inside him broke. He decided that he would no longer tolerate his wife's independence, her defiance, or her desire to leave him. In a fit of rage, Derek grabbed his gun. Jennifer had attempted to flee, but Derek chased her down. The confrontation that ensued was brutal. The details of the attack are hard to imagine. Jennifer fought back, but she was overpowered. Derek fired multiple shots, fatally wounding her. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was an act of power, of domination, of a man who could no longer tolerate the woman he claimed to love defying him. After the shooting, Derek did something that no one could have predicted. In a moment of unfathomable arrogance, he took to Facebook to share a chilling message with the world. On his account, he posted a photo of his wife's lifeless body lying in the kitchen. Along with the disturbing image, he wrote a caption, "I just killed my wife. Love you guys." The words were cold, detached, and utterly devoid of remorse. It was a confession, but it was also a performance, a grotesque act of attention-seeking that would come to define this case. The post sent shockwaves through the online community. People were stunned, horrified, and unable to comprehend what they had just seen. It wasn't just a confession, it was a spectacle. Derek had turned his crime into an event, a twisted show for his social media followers to witness. He wanted the world to know what he had done. He wanted the validation, the sympathy, the notoriety. But what he didn't understand was that his act of murder wouldn't lead to admiration, it would lead to his downfall. As the police responded to the scene, they found Derek in a nearby park, pacing and acting strangely. He wasn't trying to hide, he wasn't running away. Instead, he seemed almost calm, as if he had already accepted the inevitable. When questioned by the officers, he explained that he had killed his wife because she had threatened to leave him and because she had been cheating on him. His words were disconnected, almost robotic. He seemed to be explaining his actions as though they were justified, as though he had no remorse for what he had done. The police quickly took Derek into custody, and the investigation into Jennifer's death began. But the public's reaction to the crime was just as chilling as the crime itself. People were horrified by the fact that Derek had used social media to boast about his crime, but they were also captivated by the spectacle of it all. It wasn't just a murder, it was a public display of a broken man's psyche, laid bare for the world to see. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Derek Medina had a long history of controlling, obsessive behavior. His social media posts from the past were filled with angry rants, possessive declarations, and threats. He had shared his emotions openly online, and his followers had witnessed his slow descent into madness. But despite all of the warning signs, no one had been able to stop him. And in the end, Jennifer Alfonso paid the ultimate price. The arrest of Derek Medina was just the beginning of a long, painful journey for the family and friends of Jennifer Alfonso. The brutality of the crime and the shocking manner in which Medina had broadcasted it to the world left them with more questions than answers. For Jennifer's mother, the realization that her daughter was gone came slowly, like a cruel fog that refused to lift. Jennifer had been vibrant, full of life, a young woman with dreams and hopes of a future. She had been a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Now she was a victim in a story that would haunt not just her family, but the entire community. In the aftermath of the murder, a deep sense of disbelief settled over those who knew Jennifer. How could something like this happen? How could a man she had loved, someone who had promised to protect her, turn into a killer? Derek Medina had been a part of Jennifer's life for years, and in the beginning, things had seemed normal. Their relationship had its ups and downs, like most marriages. But what family or friend could have predicted that the quiet, controlling tendencies would one day turn into cold-blooded murder? Jennifer's mother, Clara Alfonso, had always believed in her daughter's ability to make her own choices. She had raised Jennifer to be independent, strong, and to stand up for herself. But Clara never saw the signs. She never saw the manipulation or the emotional abuse that Derek had slowly woven into their relationship. Looking back, Clara would say later, "I thought she was happy. I never saw the chains he had placed around her heart. He took her from me, and I never even saw it coming." But the truth was, the signs had been there all along. Those who had known Jennifer best began to reflect on her behavior leading up to the murder. They started to realize that Jennifer had been increasingly withdrawn, more anxious, and less like her old self. She had tried to leave Derek once before, but had returned after he begged her to stay. He promised things would change. He promised he would be better. But promises meant nothing when the cycle of control and manipulation continued. In the weeks and months leading up to her death, Jennifer had become more distant. She had confided in her friends about her fears of Derek's increasingly erratic behavior. She spoke about his jealousy, his possessiveness, and his refusal to let her go. Jennifer had even told her friends that she wanted to leave him for good, but she didn't know how. "He'll make me feel guilty," she had said. "He'll convince me to stay. He always does." What Jennifer didn't know was that her attempts to break free were the very things that pushed Derek to his breaking point. His need for control had consumed him, and the thought of losing her sent him spiraling into a violent rage that had been building for months. In the days before the murder, he had grown even more possessive, questioning her every move, accusing her of cheating, and threatening her with violence. His jealousy had become a monster of its own, and Jennifer was caught in its grip. On the day of the murder, Jennifer had finally reached her breaking point. The argument that led to her death wasn't particularly different from others they had had. Derek had demanded to know where she had been, who she had been talking to, why she hadn't responded to his messages. He was angry, and his anger was always unpredictable. He ranted and raged, accusing Jennifer of betraying him. Jennifer, tired of the constant emotional abuse, had had enough. She told him she was leaving him. She was done. But for Derek, that was not an option. He couldn't bear the thought of losing control over her. As Jennifer began to pack her things, Derek grabbed his gun. His voice grew louder, more frantic, as he demanded that she stay. When Jennifer tried to leave, he followed her, cornered her, and in the heat of the moment, he shot her. What followed was equally shocking. After the murder, Derek took to Facebook to confess his crime. He posted a photo of Jennifer's lifeless body on the floor, a disturbing image that left no room for doubt. Alongside the image, he wrote, "I just killed my wife. Love you guys." The coldness of the words, the lack of remorse, sent chills through anyone who read them. Derek Medina had not only committed murder, he had turned it into a spectacle, broadcasting his crime to the world like a sick performance. The response to Derek's Facebook post was immediate. People reacted with disbelief, horror, and anger. The authorities were alerted, and within hours, Derek was apprehended. He had confessed to the crime without hesitation, explaining that he had killed Jennifer because she was planning to leave him and because he believed she had been unfaithful. But even as he was arrested, there was something unsettling about his demeanor. He wasn't remorseful. He wasn't distraught. Instead, he acted as though the killing was justified, as though it was a natural response to being betrayed. As the investigation into Jennifer's death continued, it became clear that Derek Medina's actions were not just the result of one argument or one moment of rage. His history of controlling, obsessive behavior, coupled with his emotional instability, had created the perfect storm. Friends and family revealed that Derek had been emotionally abusive for years, constantly threatening Jennifer and controlling every aspect of her life. His social media presence was filled with rants, jealousy, and threats, all signs that had been ignored by those around him. But even with this history, Derek had been able to maintain an image of normalcy. He had convinced people, including Jennifer, that he loved her, that he was a good husband, that he could change. And it was this image, this manipulation, that allowed him to keep his grip on Jennifer for so long. As the trial began, the focus shifted to Derek's mental state. The defense team argued that he was suffering from a mental breakdown, that he had been overwhelmed by emotions and had acted in the heat of the moment. But the prosecution rejected this defense, pointing out that Derek had planned the murder and had taken steps to hide his actions afterward. He had not acted impulsively, he had acted with purpose. He had killed Jennifer because he wanted to maintain control over her, and when he couldn't, he decided that her life was no longer worth living. Jennifer's family, though devastated by the loss, stood firm in their pursuit of justice. They were determined not to let Derek's manipulation and lies define Jennifer's life. They spoke out in court, telling the world about the woman Jennifer had been before Derek had taken her from them. Jennifer had been kind, loving, and full of life. She had been a victim of abuse, but she was also a fighter. Her family made sure that her story was told, that she was remembered for who she truly was, not just as a victim of a brutal crime. In the end, Derek Medina was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But for Jennifer's family, no sentence could ever bring her back. The pain of losing her, of knowing that she had been taken so violently, would never go away. As the years pass, the case of Jennifer Alfonso's murder serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of emotional abuse and control. Derek Medina's crime wasn't just the result of one violent act. It was the culmination of years of manipulation, emotional torture, and a deep need to dominate. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented if only someone had recognized the signs. If only Jennifer had been able to escape before it was too late. And as for Derek, he may be behind bars, but his crime will never be forgotten. Because the true horror of this case lies not just in the murder itself, but in the way it was broadcast to the world. As if a life, Jennifer's life, was nothing more than a momentary spectacle. As Derek Medina sat in his cell, awaiting the next phase of his legal battle, The world outside had already begun to turn the tragedy into something it wasn't. A story of a man who snapped under emotional pressure, a man who had lost control. Yet for Jennifer Alfonso's family and friends, the narrative was far different. To them, Derek's actions were not the result of an emotional breakdown, but the culmination of years of carefully orchestrated emotional abuse and manipulation. Jennifer had been the victim of a power struggle, a struggle that Derek had ultimately won at the cost of her life. Jennifer's friends often spoke of the girl she had been before her marriage to Derek. She was a free spirit, someone who loved to dance, who found joy in the little things, and who was never afraid to speak her mind. But after she met Derek, those qualities seemed to fade. Slowly, subtly, she became a shadow of herself. The spark in her eyes dimmed, her laughter grew less frequent, and while her friends tried to support her, they never fully understood the depth of the control Derek had over her. Her mother, Clara Alfonso, would later admit that she had seen the signs. She recalled the way Derek would call Jennifer incessantly, checking where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. She remembered the way Jennifer seemed hesitant to go out with her friends, always nervous about how Derek would react. Clara saw her daughter change, but like many people who are close to a situation, she convinced herself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. After all, Jennifer loved Derek. She didn't want to make waves. She wanted to believe that despite the tension, they could work things out. Clara's guilt was palpable in the months that followed Jennifer's death. She blamed herself for not doing more, for not intervening sooner. But the truth was, no one can stop a person from staying in an abusive relationship until they are ready to leave. Jennifer had tried, but she had always returned to Derek, believing that he would change, that he loved her enough to change. But love isn't enough when one person is trying to control the other. Love can't fix emotional and psychological manipulation. The trial was a painful experience for Jennifer's family. The courtroom became a battlefield, not just for justice, but for the memory of the woman they had lost. As Derek's defense team painted him as a man driven to madness by the actions of his wife, Jennifer's family pushed back, reminding everyone that the real story was about the years of abuse and control that had led to her death. The case was not about a man who simply snapped. It was about a man who had slowly broken down the person he was supposed to love, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but control, manipulation, and ultimately, murder. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of Derek's disturbing behavior leading up to the murder. His social media presence was dissected, and it became clear that Derek had been building up to this moment for some time. His posts, his rants, his expressions of jealousy and rage painted a picture of a man who had been consumed by his need for control. He had shared his emotional turmoil openly with his followers, but in a way that twisted his victimhood into something that seemed justified. When Jennifer tried to leave, when she threatened to free herself from his grasp, Derek saw it as betrayal, a betrayal he could not accept. The photo of Jennifer's body, posted by Derek on his Facebook page, was one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The fact that Derek had shared his crime with the world in such a grotesque way was a testament to his lack of empathy and remorse. For Jennifer's family, seeing that image felt like an additional violation. Not only had they lost their daughter, but they were now forced to see her death splashed across social media for all to see. It was a cruel act of control, a final effort to dominate Jennifer even in death. Jennifer's friends who had known her before the marriage also struggled with the aftermath. They had seen the signs of her distress, but they had never fully understood the depth of the problem. They wished they had done more, said more, intervened more. But the reality was that emotional abuse is insidious. It is difficult to recognize, even harder to address, and by the time it's clear, it's often too late. One of Jennifer's close friends, Maria, spoke to the press after the trial saying, "I never knew how much pain she was in. I never knew how hard it was for her to be with him. She hid it so well. She didn't want anyone to know. She didn't want anyone to think she couldn't handle it." But the truth was, Jennifer had been handling it every day, living under the weight of Derek's control. She had been managing her life in a way that kept him happy, kept him calm, and kept the peace. But in the end, it was the peace she sacrificed. It was the life she wanted to live that was taken from her. And what hurt even more was the knowledge that her killer, her husband, had walked free for so long, even after years of emotional and psychological abuse. As the trial neared its end, the jury deliberated on Derek Medina's fate. The defense had argued that he was emotionally disturbed, that he had been pushed to the brink by Jennifer's betrayal, but the prosecution pointed to the years of abuse, the manipulation, and the deliberate nature of the crime. This was not a moment of madness. This was a man who had calculated his actions, who had spent months, if not years, setting the stage for this final, deadly act. Derek was convicted of second-degree murder, a verdict that left many in the courtroom with a sense of dissatisfaction. For Jennifer's family, second-degree murder was not enough. They wanted justice for their daughter, not just in the form of a conviction, but in the form of a recognition that Jennifer's life had mattered, that her death wasn't just another tragic incident. It was the result of years of emotional manipulation and control, and it deserved to be acknowledged as such. But despite their disappointment with the verdict, they knew that justice would never truly be served. Nothing would bring Jennifer back. In the years that followed, the story of Derek Medina and Jennifer Alfonso continued to haunt those who had been affected by it. Jennifer's family and friends tried to move forward, but the weight of her loss was always with them. They sought to turn their grief into something positive, to advocate for victims of domestic abuse, and to raise awareness about the warning signs that so often go unrecognized. But even as they worked to honor Jennifer's memory, they couldn't help but feel the sting of what had been taken from them. Jennifer Alfonso's story is not just one of tragedy. It is a reminder of the dangers of emotional abuse, of the silent control that can slowly suffocate someone until they can no longer breathe. It is a reminder that love is not about control and that no one should have to live in fear of the person they love. It is a story that should never be forgotten, because in the end, it's not just about the crime. It's about the life that was taken and the life that was never given the chance to be lived. As the dust from Derek Medina's trial settled, the media began to shift its focus away from the specifics of the case and onto the broader issue of domestic violence and its deadly consequences. The story of Jennifer Alfonso's tragic end became an example of how dangerous toxic relationships can be and how society often overlooks the signs of abuse until it's too late. This story, though it ended in horror, sparked a conversation that was desperately needed. A conversation about control, manipulation, and the long-lasting scars left by emotional and psychological abuse. For Jennifer's family, the question of how this could have been prevented loomed large. They had watched their daughter grow up, full of life and joy, only to see her become a shell of herself as her marriage with Derek progressed. Jennifer had been a beautiful woman, vibrant, with a smile that could light up a room. But by the time she met Derek, she had already been through her share of heartbreak and disappointment. Her previous relationships hadn't been easy, but Derek had promised to be different. He promised that she would never have to go through anything like that again. And yet she ended up in a situation far worse than anything she could have imagined. Jennifer's friends later admitted that they had seen the red flags, but they hadn't known how to help. "You don't want to believe that someone you care about is in danger," one of her friends explained. "You want to believe that they can handle it, that everything will be fine. But now I see the signs, and I wish I could have done more. I wish I had known how bad it was." These feelings of guilt and helplessness were shared by many of Jennifer's loved ones. They wondered, with deep regret, if there had been something they could have said or done to help her escape Derek's grip before it was too late. While the criminal justice system had handed down a verdict, there was a sense that it had failed Jennifer long before she ended up in the courtroom. As her family and friends fought for justice, they struggled with the realization that the system had failed to recognize the danger Derek Medina posed to those around him. His previous behavior had been a clear indication of his volatile nature. Violent rages, threats, and a history of emotional abuse. And yet he had been allowed to continue his life as though nothing had happened, given the chance to marry Jennifer and build a life together. But all the while, his need for control and dominance had been festering beneath the surface. The impact of Derek's actions extended far beyond the courtroom. Jennifer's mother, Clara, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. No one could prepare for the grief of losing a child, let alone in such a senseless and violent way. Clara often spoke about the pain of seeing her daughter's name in headlines and hearing about her death on the news. "It's not supposed to happen like that," Clara would say, choking back tears. "You're not supposed to bury your child. Your child is supposed to bury you." But beyond her grief, Clara also felt a burning desire to make sure her daughter's story was not just another forgotten tragedy. She wanted to make sure people understood what had led to Jennifer's death and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. Clara became an advocate for domestic violence victims, speaking out about the subtle ways abuse can infiltrate a relationship, especially when it's masked behind promises of love and security. She would attend rallies, speak at conferences, and meet with legislators to push for stricter laws surrounding emotional and psychological abuse. Jennifer's friends, too, became involved in the cause, using their pain as fuel to drive change. They worked to raise awareness about the signs of domestic abuse, encouraging people to look beyond the physical bruises and recognize the emotional scars that so often go unnoticed. They shared Jennifer's story, hoping it would resonate with someone who might be in a similar situation. They hoped that by telling her story, they could prevent another family from experiencing the same pain and heartbreak that they had endured. Derek Medina's behavior in the aftermath of the crime was as chilling as the crime itself. His lack of remorse, his indifference to the life he had taken, and his obsession with self-justification were all clear indicators of his true nature. But perhaps what was most disturbing was his complete inability to recognize the humanity of his wife. To Derek, Jennifer had never been an individual with her own thoughts, feelings, and desires. She was an object to be controlled, to be manipulated, to be molded into what he wanted her to be. And when she tried to break free, when she finally found the courage to leave him, he killed her, unable to cope with the loss of control. Derek's online behavior, particularly his posts before and after the murder, painted a picture of a man who had no understanding of the magnitude of his actions. His confession, posted on Facebook, was a bizarre mixture of self-pity and detachment. He didn't apologize for killing his wife. He didn't express any sorrow for her family or for the life he had taken. Instead, he posted a photo of her body with the words, "I just killed my wife. Love you guys." To him, it was as if the crime had been just another event in his life, something he could share with his online followers, something he could turn into a spectacle. This disturbing act was not just an expression of guilt or regret. It was a grotesque display of self-centeredness and a complete lack of empathy. In the wake of the murder, many people questioned how Derek had been able to maintain his public persona for so long. How had he managed to manipulate those around him, to make them believe that he was a loving, caring husband? His ability to convince others of his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, spoke to the power of emotional manipulation. He had been able to mask his abusive behavior behind the facade of a normal marriage, making those around him believe that the problems in his relationship with Jennifer were no different from those in any other marriage. In the years that followed, the murder of Jennifer Alfonso continued to haunt those who had known her. Her family, her friends, her co-workers, all of them were left to deal with the aftermath of a life that was senselessly cut short. But as time passed, they also worked to ensure that Jennifer's story would not be forgotten. Through their advocacy, through their efforts to raise awareness, they hoped that Jennifer's death would not have been in vain. For Derek Medina, the consequences of his actions would be a long time coming. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison, but no sentence could ever truly compensate for the life he had taken. His actions had destroyed not just Jennifer's life, but the lives of everyone who had loved her. And in the end, the punishment he received could never bring her back. As the case faded from the public eye, Jennifer's family and friends remained steadfast in their mission. They fought to make sure her death wasn't just another statistic, another forgotten tragedy. Jennifer was more than just a victim. She was a woman who had loved, who had hoped, and who had fought to live her life on her terms. And they would make sure that her story was told. Jennifer Alfonso's death is a reminder of the dangers of emotional and psychological abuse, a reminder of how control can slowly take root in a relationship and how hard it can be to escape. But it is also a testament to the strength of those who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. It's a reminder that even in death, Jennifer still had the power to change lives. And that power, though born from tragedy, continues to echo in the voices of those who will never stop fighting for her memory. As the years passed, the tragedy of Jennifer Alfonso's death continued to resonate with those who had loved her. Though the case itself faded from the media's spotlight, Jennifer's legacy lived on through the voices of those who had known her best. For her family, the grief never truly subsided. Clara Alfonso, Jennifer's mother, often spoke about the emptiness she felt every day. "There's no closure," she would say. "You never stop thinking about what could have been, what should have been." Jennifer's family and friends who had once felt powerless to help her now channeled their pain into advocacy. They pushed for legislative changes to better protect victims of domestic violence and to ensure that emotional and psychological abuse were taken as seriously as physical violence. The public conversation around domestic abuse, which had been largely hidden in the shadows, was brought to the forefront by Jennifer's story. Her death, though tragic, had sparked a movement that sought to bring the invisible wounds of emotional and psychological abuse into the light. One of the most painful aspects of Jennifer's case was the realization that her suffering had been largely invisible to those who loved her. Jennifer had tried to confide in her friends and family, but the signs of her emotional pain had often been overlooked. Abuse, especially emotional and psychological abuse, doesn't always leave visible marks. It doesn't always show up in bruises or cuts. It's the slow erosion of someone's self-worth, the constant manipulation and control, the isolation that occurs in the dead of night, behind closed doors. Jennifer's friends wished they had known what was happening behind the scenes. They wished they could have done more, said more, to help her escape. In the wake of Jennifer's death, many of those who had been closest to her began to speak out, sharing their experiences and offering insights into the dangers of toxic relationships. They shared their stories of watching someone they loved slowly disappear into a relationship that consumed them. They spoke about the confusion, the guilt, and the fear that often accompany emotional abuse. And in doing so, they hoped to prevent other families from experiencing the same pain. Derek Medina's trial and conviction, while bringing a sense of justice, did little to alleviate the sense of loss that Jennifer's family and friends felt. Derek's indifference throughout the trial only made the pain worse. His lack of remorse, his insistence on justifying his actions, showed a man who was completely disconnected from the reality of what he had done. He had not just killed Jennifer. He had shattered her family, her friends, and her community. He had taken away a young woman with a bright future, a woman who was full of potential and promise. And yet, he seemed unaffected by the destruction he had caused. For Jennifer's family, the hardest part was coming to terms with the fact that they would never see her again. Jennifer's mother, Clara, often spoke about how much she missed her daughter's laugh, her warmth, and her joy. "She was everything to me," Clara said. "I can't describe what it's like to lose a child. It's something you never imagine will happen to you. You think your child will always be there, and then one day, they're not." As the years passed, Jennifer's family worked to create something positive out of their heartbreak. They set up a foundation in her name, dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting victims of emotional and psychological abuse. The foundation became a place where survivors could share their stories, seek help, and find support. It was a way for Jennifer's family to honor her memory, to ensure that her death would not be in vain. Clara Alfonso, Jennifer's mother, also became an outspoken advocate for victims of domestic violence. She worked with local shelters, spoke at conferences, and met with lawmakers to push for stronger laws protecting women from abuse. Through her grief, Clara found strength. She channeled her pain into action, determined to make sure that other families wouldn't have to endure the same heartbreak that hers had. But despite all the efforts to make a difference, the pain of losing Jennifer never fully went away. Every year on the anniversary of her death, Jennifer's family would gather together to honor her memory. They would light candles, share stories, and remember the girl they had lost. And while they found some comfort in their advocacy and their efforts to make a difference, they knew that the hole left by Jennifer's absence would never be filled. For Derek Medina, his fate was sealed the moment he decided to take Jennifer's life. After being convicted of second-degree murder, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but the punishment, while a legal consequence, could never compensate for the life he had taken. Jennifer Alfonso's death had not just destroyed her, it had destroyed everyone who loved her. The ripple effect of his actions spread far beyond the walls of the courtroom, leaving lasting scars on everyone involved. Derek Medina's time in prison became an afterthought. He would spend the next 2 decades behind bars, paying for his crime. But no amount of time could ever undo the damage he had caused. No amount of punishment could ever bring Jennifer back. And as the years went on, it became clear that the legacy of Derek Medina's crime would be far greater than any sentence he could receive. His actions had forever altered the lives of Jennifer's family and friends. They would carry the pain of her loss with them for the rest of their lives. The real tragedy of Jennifer Alfonso's death wasn't just the crime itself. It was the silent destruction of her spirit, the slow unraveling of her sense of self, the crushing weight of emotional and psychological abuse that she had suffered for so long. She had been a victim long before the final fatal confrontation. The true horror of her death lay in the fact that, even in her marriage to Derek, she had been invisible, her pain hidden behind closed doors, behind the smiles she wore in public, behind the facade of normalcy she tried so desperately to maintain. But Jennifer's family and friends refused to let her story be forgotten. They spoke her name. They told her story. They made sure that her life was remembered, not just as a victim, but as a person who had once been full of promise, full of hope, full of life. And through their work, they ensured that Jennifer Alfonso's death would not just be another statistic, but a reminder of the dangers of emotional abuse, the importance of speaking up, and the need for stronger protections for those who are too often silenced. Jennifer's story will forever be intertwined with the fight for victims of domestic violence, and her death will continue to serve as a warning to others about the destructive power of control, manipulation, and emotional abuse. While her life was tragically cut short, her voice continues to echo through the advocacy and awareness efforts of those who loved her. The years following the murder of Jennifer Alfonso were a blur for her family and friends. While Derek Medina sat in prison, serving his sentence for second-degree murder, those who had loved Jennifer struggled to rebuild their lives. The pain of losing her was still raw, still constant. Her family tried to find ways to honor her memory, but the weight of her absence was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Jennifer's life had been taken violently, cruelly, and suddenly, leaving a void that no amount of advocacy or legal justice could fill. She was gone, and nothing would ever bring her back. But in the silence of their grief, Jennifer's family began to realize something important. The story of her death could not be just about the crime. It needed to be about the life she had lived, the love she had shared, and the future that had been stolen from her. Jennifer was more than just a victim of domestic violence. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with dreams, hopes, and potential. Her death could not be reduced to a statistic or an unfortunate incident. Her life mattered, and her story needed to be told. Not just for her, but for the countless others who had suffered silently in similar situations. Clara Alfonso, Jennifer's mother, became the loudest voice in her memory. Despite the overwhelming grief, she found strength in her pain. She worked tirelessly to raise awareness about domestic violence, speaking to anyone who would listen about the warning signs, the dangers of emotional abuse, and the need for better protections for women like her daughter. She began speaking at conferences, participating in campaigns, and meeting with legislators to push for changes in the way society views emotional and psychological abuse. Her voice became a beacon for other victims, and her determination to ensure that Jennifer's death wasn't in vain became the driving force behind her work. But even as she poured herself into this work, Clara was haunted by her memories of Jennifer. She remembered her laughter, her joy, and her unwavering love for life. Clara would visit Jennifer's grave regularly, often sitting in silence, reflecting on the daughter she had lost and the promise she had made to keep her memory alive. It was during these moments of solitude that Clara would think about the countless signs she had missed in her daughter's relationship. She thought about the early warning signs, the emotional manipulation, the control, the isolation, and how, in hindsight, they were so glaringly obvious. Clara wondered if she had seen those signs sooner. Could she have saved Jennifer? Could she have convinced her to leave Derek before it was too late? Clara knew the answer was complicated. Emotional abuse is insidious. It doesn't leave bruises or broken bones. It's a quiet kind of destruction, one that's often invisible to the outside world. Jennifer had tried to leave Derek before, but like so many victims of abuse, she had been sucked back into the toxic cycle. Derek's promises of change, his apologies, his manipulations, these were the things that kept Jennifer tethered to him. And in the end, they were the things that led to her death. Jennifer's friends, too, struggled with the aftermath of her death. They had seen the toll her marriage had taken on her, but they had never imagined it would lead to something so tragic. In the months following Jennifer's death, her friends tried to make sense of what had happened. They spent hours on the phone, crying together, sharing memories of Jennifer, and trying to understand how such a beautiful, vibrant young woman could end up in a relationship so dangerous. One of Jennifer's closest friends, Maria, shared her feelings in an interview shortly after the trial. "I just couldn't believe it. She was one of the strongest people I knew. She was always so full of life. And yet here we are. She's gone. And I don't know what to do with that." Maria had been Jennifer's confidant for years, and she had watched her friend become increasingly isolated as Derek's control over her grew stronger. Jennifer had stopped going out with friends, stopped answering her phone, and had even stopped participating in the activities she had once loved. Maria had noticed the changes, but like so many others, she didn't fully understand the depth of the abuse. "I thought it was just the stress of their marriage," Maria said. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I didn't see how much she was suffering until it was too late." As Jennifer's family and friends began to piece together the details of the abusive relationship she had endured, they started to realize just how common her experience was. Domestic violence, especially emotional and psychological abuse, is often dismissed or misunderstood. The signs are subtle, and the victim is often blamed or criticized for staying in the relationship. The stigma surrounding abuse, particularly emotional abuse, leaves many victims isolated and without support. Jennifer's story became a stark reminder of the consequences of that stigma and the need for society to take these issues seriously. Clara worked with local shelters to provide support for other victims of domestic abuse. She began to speak openly about the emotional and psychological toll that abuse can take on a person and how it can often lead to a tragic ending if not addressed. Jennifer's story, in the hands of those who loved her, became a tool for education and advocacy. Her family and friends hoped that by sharing Jennifer's life and the circumstances leading up to her death, they could prevent another family from experiencing the same heartbreak. But as much as Clara and the others worked to raise awareness and push for change, the pain of losing Jennifer was never far behind. Clara often spoke about how the grief didn't get easier with time. It just became more manageable. "I carry her with me every day," Clara said. "I feel like I'm always waiting for her to walk through the door. I don't know how to let go of that. I don't know how to accept that she's gone." Despite the immense pain, Clara found solace in knowing that Jennifer's life had not been forgotten. The foundation that Clara helped create, in Jennifer's name, became a source of comfort for those who were struggling in similar situations. It became a symbol of hope for victims who felt isolated and powerless. And for Clara, that was enough. She didn't want Jennifer's death to be in vain. She didn't want her daughter to be remembered solely for how she died, but for how she lived and for the fight she had put up to escape. Derek Medina's trial may have been over, but Jennifer's story was far from finished. Through the advocacy of those who loved her, Jennifer's legacy lived on. Her story wasn't just one of death, but of the enduring strength of those who survive. And as the years went by, Jennifer's story continued to save lives. It reminded others that abuse, in all its forms, can take root in the most unlikely of places. It reminded them that love should never hurt, that control should never be a substitute for affection, and that no one deserves to live in fear. In the end, Jennifer Alfonso's death was not just a tragedy. It was a call to action. It was a plea for understanding, for compassion, and for change. And through her family's unwavering commitment, it became a catalyst for that change. A change that would make a difference for those who had no voice, no support, and no way out. As the years went by, the shadows of Jennifer Alfonso's death never truly faded from the lives of those who loved her. Despite their best efforts to rebuild their lives and find some semblance of normalcy, The trauma of that night and the aftermath continued to reverberate. Jennifer's name would forever be associated with the tragic violence of her death, but her family refused to let that be the only story told. They fought tirelessly to ensure that her legacy was not just one of loss, but one of change and progress. The foundation they created in Jennifer's name grew, becoming an invaluable resource for victims of domestic violence across the country. The organization's mission was clear: to raise awareness about the dangers of emotional and psychological abuse, and to provide support for those who were trapped in toxic relationships. The foundation offered counseling, legal assistance, and a safe space for survivors to share their stories. But even more importantly, it worked to educate the public about the signs of abuse, signs that are often overlooked or dismissed, especially when the abuse isn't physical. Jennifer's mother, Clara, became a driving force behind the foundation, speaking at conferences, organizing rallies, and working with lawmakers to push for stronger domestic violence laws. She met with survivors, listened to their stories, and shared Jennifer's story in the hopes that it would help others find the strength to escape their own abusive relationships. It wasn't easy for Clara. Every time she spoke about Jennifer, it felt like reopening a wound that would never fully heal. But she knew it was necessary. She knew that Jennifer's story could save lives, and that was the only thing that kept her going. One of the most powerful moments came when Clara stood before a room of survivors at a national conference on domestic violence. She had been invited to speak about her daughter's life and death, and about the work they were doing to honor her memory. Clara began her speech by saying, "I never thought I would be standing here, sharing my daughter's story. I never thought I would be standing in front of so many people who have suffered the same pain I have. But here we are, and together we can make sure that no more lives are lost like Jennifer's." Clara's words resonated with the survivors in the room. Many of them had been through similar experiences, years of emotional manipulation, control, and isolation. They understood the heartbreak of seeing someone you love slowly change, losing their identity, their confidence, and their sense of self. And like Clara, many of them felt a burning desire to do something, to change the narrative, to prevent another person from being trapped in an abusive relationship like Jennifer had been. Jennifer's story also helped shift the conversation about emotional abuse in the public sphere. Though physical abuse has long been recognized as a form of domestic violence, emotional and psychological abuse remained largely invisible. Jennifer's murder, and the revelations about the control and manipulation she had endured, helped to shine a light on this often overlooked aspect of abuse. Experts began to speak more openly about the dangers of emotional abuse, explaining how it could be just as damaging, if not more so, than physical violence. The scars of emotional abuse are invisible, but they are deep and long-lasting. In the months after Jennifer's death, there was a growing recognition that emotional abuse could lead to deadly outcomes. Domestic violence advocates began to push for legal reforms that would provide greater protections for victims of emotional and psychological abuse. Some states passed new laws that recognized emotional abuse as a form of domestic violence, providing victims with greater legal recourse and support. But despite these efforts, much work remained to be done. Emotional abuse is still often dismissed, and many victims continue to suffer in silence. But for Clara and Jennifer's friends, the fight was personal. They had seen the toll that emotional abuse had taken on Jennifer. They had watched her change over the years, becoming more withdrawn, more isolated, and more afraid of standing up for herself. They had seen the signs, but they had never fully understood what was happening until it was too late. And so, they became advocates for those who couldn't speak for themselves, for those who were still living in the kind of silence that had eventually claimed Jennifer's life. Despite their grief, Clara and her family took solace in the progress that had been made in the wake of Jennifer's death. The foundation continued to grow, providing resources and support for survivors of domestic violence. Survivors who had once felt isolated and hopeless found a sense of community through Jennifer's legacy. And though nothing could ever bring Jennifer back, her family knew that they were making a difference. They were helping to create a world where other women wouldn't have to endure the same pain Jennifer had. But there was still the matter of the man who had taken Jennifer's life, Derek Medina. While Clara and her family worked to make sure Jennifer's death was not in vain, they also struggled with the knowledge that Derek's punishment could never truly match the magnitude of his crime. Jennifer's life had been stolen from her in the most violent and brutal way, and the 25-year sentence Derek received seemed to pale in comparison to the devastation he had caused. For Jennifer's family, the fact that Derek would one day be released from prison was a haunting thought. Even though he was behind bars, they knew that his actions would forever haunt them. Derek had taken so much from them, not just Jennifer's life, but the future they could have shared together. And yet, Derek had shown no remorse for his actions. He had made no effort to make amends, to apologize, to acknowledge the pain he had caused. Instead, he had continued to justify his crime, to claim that Jennifer's death had been justified because of her supposed betrayal. In the years since the murder, Derek Medina's name had become synonymous with the cold, calculated nature of the crime he had committed. He had used social media to broadcast his crime to the world, showing a complete lack of empathy and remorse. The world had watched as he confessed to murder with chilling detachment. His actions, his lack of emotion, his arrogance, his need for attention, became a defining feature of his character. And as the years passed, Derek Medina's infamy grew. His name was mentioned in countless discussions about domestic violence, about the dangers of emotional abuse, and about the need for better protections for women. But for Jennifer's family, Derek's name represented something much more personal. A man who had taken their daughter, their sister, their friend, and turned her into a victim. Derek Medina's actions had shattered their world, and no amount of time in prison could ever fix that. In the end, Jennifer Alfonso's death became a catalyst for change. It sparked a conversation about the dangers of emotional and psychological abuse, about the need for better support for victims, and about the importance of recognizing the warning signs of abuse before it's too late. Jennifer's family, through their advocacy and their commitment to her memory, had helped create a world where the abuse Jennifer had suffered was no longer invisible. Though Jennifer's life was tragically cut short, her story would continue to make a difference for years to come. Her name would live on in the hearts of those who loved her, and her legacy would be felt by generations of women who would no longer suffer in silence. Jennifer Alfonso may have been taken from this world too soon, but her story was far from over. As the years passed, the wound left by Jennifer Alfonso's death remained raw. But the work her family had done to honor her memory began to take root in the broader conversation about domestic violence. Their tireless efforts to advocate for change had made a significant impact, pushing the conversation forward on a national scale. Still, for those closest to Jennifer, it never felt like enough. No amount of advocacy, no amount of media attention could fill the void that had been left when Derek Medina took Jennifer's life. Clara Alfonso, Jennifer's mother, continued to channel her grief into action. She had become a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. But as much as she fought to ensure Jennifer's story was not forgotten, there was always a part of her that struggled to come to terms with the senselessness of it all. Every day, Clara would wake up, go through the motions, and try to make a difference for others. But the pain of not having her daughter by her side was ever present. She would never again hear Jennifer's laugh, never again see her smile, never again hug her daughter and tell her how proud she was. For Clara, the journey toward healing was long and uncertain. Every milestone, every birthday, every holiday, every year that passed was a painful reminder that Jennifer was gone. But Clara found strength in the knowledge that Jennifer's death had not been in vain. Through the foundation they had created in her name, Jennifer's legacy lived on, and her story continued to touch the lives of countless others. Jennifer's friends, too, found ways to honor her memory, each in their own way. Maria, one of Jennifer's closest friends, channeled her grief into activism. She spoke at domestic violence events, shared Jennifer's story with anyone who would listen, and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the dangers of emotional abuse. She also became involved in the foundation, helping to spread the message of hope and survival to those who needed it most. Jennifer was my best friend, Maria said in a powerful interview years after Jennifer's death. She was always there for me, and now I want to be there for others. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what she went through. But even as they worked to ensure Jennifer's story wasn't forgotten, the questions about Derek Medina's actions lingered. Why had he killed her? What had driven him to such a violent act? And why, after the crime, did he seem so detached, so unwilling to take responsibility for what he had done? The chilling photo he posted on Facebook, the lack of remorse in his confession, and his claim that Jennifer had betrayed him, these things haunted Jennifer's family. Derek Medina's indifference to Jennifer's death was a stark contrast to the pain and suffering his crime had caused. But even more disturbing was the way he seemed to revel in the attention his crime had generated. His need for validation, his desire to be seen as a victim, were all part of the twisted narrative he had created around his actions. As time went on, there were moments of reflection. Derek's behavior had not come out of nowhere. His social media history, filled with angry rants, possessive declarations, and veiled threats, painted a picture of a man who had long been consumed by his need for control. In hindsight, his actions were a natural extension of the emotional abuse he had been inflicting on Jennifer for years. His possessiveness, his jealousy, his constant questioning of her every move. These were all warning signs, signs that had gone unnoticed or ignored. Jennifer had tried to break free, to leave him, but each time she had returned, believing that he could change. She had believed his promises, his apologies. But Derek Medina was not a man who could change. He was a man who would stop at nothing to maintain control over the person he loved, even if it meant taking her life. Derek's trial had been a public spectacle, one that showed the world the depth of his emotional manipulation and his inability to understand the consequences of his actions. His defense tried to paint him as a man who had snapped, a man who had been pushed too far by the actions of his wife. But the prosecution made it clear that Derek's actions were premeditated, that this was not a crime of passion, but a crime of control. Jennifer had been a victim, not just of Derek's violence, but of his ability to make her believe that she was the problem, that she was the one who had driven him to this point. The case also raised important questions about the role of social media in modern crimes. Derek Medina's use of Facebook to confess his crime to the world was unprecedented in its grotesqueness. His desire to share the details of his crime, to turn his wife's death into a public spectacle, was a disturbing display of his need for attention and validation. But it also raised questions about the role of technology in enabling the dissemination of violence. In the age of social media, crimes like Jennifer's can no longer be contained within the walls of the home. They are broadcast to the world, often before law enforcement can even respond. The rise of social media has changed the way crimes are reported and the way we think about justice. In this case, Derek Medina's use of Facebook was a horrifying reminder of how technology can be used to perpetuate violence rather than prevent it. As the years went on, the conversation around domestic violence began to shift. More people were speaking out about the dangers of emotional and psychological abuse, and more attention was being paid to the ways in which these forms of abuse can lead to deadly outcomes. Domestic violence advocates worked tirelessly to ensure that emotional abuse was recognized as a legitimate form of harm, one that could be just as damaging as physical violence. And though progress was slow, there was a sense that things were changing. But for Clara and Jennifer's friends, the fight was personal. They knew that no amount of legal reform, no amount of media attention could bring Jennifer back. She was gone, and that was a reality they had to live with every day. But they also knew that their work, their advocacy, was making a difference. They were helping to create a world where women didn't have to live in fear, where people could recognize the signs of abuse and take action before it was too late. And that, in some small way, helped ease the pain of their loss. Jennifer Alfonso's death was a tragedy, a senseless and heartbreaking loss of a life that had so much potential. But her legacy was not defined by her death. It was defined by the work of those who loved her, who refused to let her story be one of silence and obscurity. Jennifer's death was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a movement, a call to action, a reminder that no one should ever live in fear and that every voice matters. In the years to come, Jennifer's family would continue to fight for justice, for change, and for the memory of the woman they had lost. They would continue to honor her legacy through the work they did, through the lives they touched, and through the voices they raised. Jennifer may have been taken from them too soon, but her impact on the world would last far beyond the walls of that courtroom. And as long as her story was told, she would never truly be gone. Years had passed since the tragic day that Jennifer Alfonso's life was stolen from her. The relentless ache of her loss had not subsided for her family, but through their tireless advocacy, they had transformed their grief into a mission. They had made it their life's work to ensure that Jennifer's death was not simply a tragic event in the headlines, but a catalyst for real, meaningful change. Through the foundation they established in her name, they sought to educate and empower others, to provide resources for those caught in the same cycle of abuse that Jennifer had been unable to escape. But the fight for justice was never truly over. Each year brought new challenges, new legislative battles, and continued efforts to raise awareness about the often hidden dangers of emotional and psychological abuse. The foundation continued to grow, providing counseling and legal support for survivors of domestic violence, as well as educating communities about the signs of abusive relationships. Jennifer's family worked with lawmakers to push for stronger protections for those suffering from emotional abuse, an issue that had long been overlooked by society. Despite the foundation's success and the progress they made in the fight against domestic violence, there was an undeniable feeling of emptiness that hung over Jennifer's loved ones. They had done everything they could to honor her memory, but nothing could replace the pain of losing her. Clara Alfonso, in particular, struggled with the weight of her loss. Her grief never truly left her. She would have flashes of memory, the way Jennifer's laughter would fill the room, the way her daughter would light up a conversation, the way her presence brought warmth to any gathering. It was these small, fleeting moments that caused Clara the most pain. They were constant reminders of the life Jennifer should have had. Clara had often spoken about the difficulty of finding peace after Jennifer's death. It wasn't just the loss of a child that hurt. It was the loss of what could have been. Jennifer had been on the brink of creating a life of her own. She had a future ahead of her, dreams and ambitions she had yet to realize. Derek Medina had taken all of that from her in a single violent moment. Clara had often wished she could have protected her daughter from the slow unraveling of her marriage, the silent terror that had grown behind closed doors. But the truth was, Jennifer had been unable to escape on her own. She had tried, but the cycle of manipulation, control, and emotional abuse had been too strong. Jennifer's friends, like Maria, continued their advocacy work too. Maria, who had been Jennifer's confidant, found herself grappling with the same guilt that plagued Clara. But she also found solace in the work they were doing to prevent other victims from experiencing the same fate. Maria knew that while they couldn't bring Jennifer back, they could make sure her death wasn't in vain. She and others involved in the foundation traveled across the country, speaking at events, raising awareness, and providing survivors with the resources they so desperately needed. The foundation also provided support for those who were still trapped in abusive relationships, victims who felt powerless to escape, who believed there was no way out. Over time, the foundation became a powerful voice in the fight against domestic violence. Jennifer's story was shared on countless platforms, through documentaries, public speaking events, social media campaigns, and more. Each time her story was told, more people were made aware of the signs of emotional abuse. More people were encouraged to speak out, and more people were able to find the courage to leave abusive relationships. Jennifer's legacy lived on in the lives of those who were saved by the awareness her family had raised. Derek Medina, meanwhile, remained in prison, serving out his 25-year sentence. His actions had been driven by his own warped sense of entitlement, his obsessive need for control. But even in prison, he showed little remorse. Reports from inside the prison system indicated that Derek had remained steadfast in his belief that Jennifer's death had been justified. He continued to maintain that she had been unfaithful to him, and that her desire to leave him had pushed him over the edge. But this narrative was one that Derek clung to because it allowed him to avoid confronting the truth, that he had been a manipulator, an abuser, and ultimately a murderer. For Jennifer's family, the knowledge that Derek would one day be released from prison was a constant source of anxiety. 25 years might seem like a long time, but for Clara, Maria, and the rest of Jennifer's loved ones, it was a drop in the ocean compared to the lifetime of pain Derek had caused. The fear that Derek might one day be free, able to walk among them, was something they would have to live with forever. And yet, despite the fear of Derek's eventual release, there was a sense of peace that came with knowing they had done everything they could. The foundation, the advocacy work, the stories shared by survivors, All of these efforts were proof that Jennifer's life had meant something, that her death had sparked change. And for Clara, that was a bittersweet comfort. It would never erase the emptiness she felt, but it provided a sense of purpose. Jennifer had died, but her legacy continued to fight for those who still had a chance to escape the cycle of abuse. Clara would often tell the story of Jennifer's favorite saying, "Life is short, but love is forever." She had always believed in the power of love, even in the face of tragedy. And now, in the face of unimaginable loss, Clara was carrying that message forward. Her love for Jennifer and Jennifer's love for her would never fade. It was something that would live on in the work they did, in the lives they touched, and in the hearts of those who loved her. As the foundation continued to grow, it became clear that Jennifer's legacy was becoming something much larger than anyone had imagined. The awareness they had raised, the lives they had saved, the change they had sparked, these were the things that mattered most. Jennifer's death, tragic and senseless as it was, had become a catalyst for change. It had brought attention to the dangers of emotional abuse and had given survivors a platform to share their stories. The tragedy of her life was no longer a story of defeat. It was a story of hope, of transformation, and of the strength that can arise from even the darkest of times. And as for Jennifer herself, her memory would live on, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of strength, resilience, and the power of love. She may have been taken too soon, but her story would continue to save lives, to raise awareness, and to provide hope for those who were trapped in the same cycle she had been. Her story, told time and again, would remind the world that no one is ever truly gone as long as their story is told. And in that way, Jennifer Alfonso would always be with them, her love, her spirit, and her courage never fading, never forgotten. As Jennifer Alfonso's story continued to echo across the country, it became clear that her death had transcended the personal tragedy that had once defined it. Her story was now a beacon for those trapped in abusive relationships, a symbol of the hidden scars that so often go unnoticed in our society. Her name had become synonymous with the fight against domestic violence, particularly the often overlooked forms of emotional and psychological abuse that had been the root of her suffering. Clara Alfonso, Jennifer's mother, had become not just a grieving mother, but a warrior for change. The advocacy work she had undertaken in the years following Jennifer's death had blossomed into a powerful movement. What had begun as a desperate attempt to make sense of her pain had turned into a mission to save others from suffering the same fate. She was no longer just speaking about the loss of her daughter, she was speaking for the countless women who had suffered in silence, who had been trapped in cycles of manipulation, fear, and emotional abuse, often without even realizing the damage being done until it was too late. In the years that followed, Clara's voice became a staple in discussions about domestic violence reform. She was invited to speak at legislative hearings, participate in interviews on national television, and work alongside organizations focused on providing resources for victims. Through her, Jennifer's story continued to reach millions. She shared the raw, painful truth of Jennifer's last moments, but she also shared the life Jennifer had lived before her marriage to Derek Medina, the bright, ambitious young woman who had been full of promise. In doing so, Clara ensured that Jennifer was remembered not just as a victim of an abusive marriage, but as a woman who had been more than the tragedy of her death. Jennifer's friends, too, became passionate advocates for the cause. Maria, still deeply affected by the loss of her best friend, dedicated herself to supporting survivors and raising awareness about the long-term effects of emotional abuse. She continued to speak at conferences, meet with survivors, and use her voice to amplify the message that emotional abuse was just as dangerous as physical violence. In many ways, Maria had become a living tribute to Jennifer, carrying her memory with every step she took in her advocacy. But there were times when Maria, Clara, and others who had been so close to Jennifer still struggled with the overwhelming grief. There were nights when Clara couldn't sleep, haunted by the images of her daughter's smile, her laugh, and the future that was taken away. Jennifer had been so full of life, and the world seemed so much dimmer without her in it. The emptiness was still palpable, even as Clara and the others worked to turn their pain into something positive. Clara often recalled the quiet moments, the ones when it was just her and Jennifer, before everything had gone wrong. She would remember the sound of Jennifer's voice, the way she would make jokes, her passion for life, and the love they shared. Clara had always been there for her daughter, but she had never fully understood the depths of the control and manipulation that Jennifer was enduring. No one could have imagined the horror that would unfold that night in their home. Even after all the years of advocacy and outreach, Clara still struggled with the question that plagued her from the moment Jennifer's life had been taken. Why couldn't I protect her? It was a question that Clara would never fully have an answer to. But in her heart, she knew that Jennifer had fought for her freedom, that she had fought to leave the toxic relationship that had consumed her for so long. Jennifer had been brave, and her bravery would live on through the work that Clara and the others had done to fight for the rights of those who still suffered in silence. Every survivor they helped, every law they helped to pass, was a tribute to Jennifer's strength and courage. Derek Medina, for his part, seemed oblivious to the impact his actions had had on Jennifer's family and on the public. After being convicted of second-degree murder, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, though many felt the sentence was far too light for the life he had taken. In prison, Derek's behavior had not improved. Reports indicated that he continued to justify his crime, repeatedly claiming that Jennifer had been unfaithful and that her decision to leave him had driven him to violence. His unwillingness to take full responsibility for his actions showed the deep denial that still existed within him. Derek Medina had never accepted that his crime was the result of his own unchecked rage and desire for control. He refused to acknowledge that Jennifer's death was not an accident of passion, but the cold, calculated outcome of years of emotional abuse. It was this lack of remorse that made Derek Medina's continued presence in prison even more disturbing for Jennifer's family. They knew that while he would serve his time behind bars, the pain he had caused them would never be mitigated. The years would pass, but their grief, their anger, and their desire for justice would remain unchanged. Every day as Derek sat in prison, Jennifer's memory was kept alive through the advocacy of those who loved her, but it would never feel like enough. Clara often spoke about the challenge of balancing her grief with her determination to make a difference. She didn't want Jennifer's death to be a statistic, a story that faded into the background. She wanted it to be a turning point, a moment that forced society to confront the realities of emotional abuse. Jennifer's death had sparked a shift in the way we think about domestic violence, but Clara knew that change would come too slowly to save the women and children who were still suffering in silence. There would always be more work to do, more people to educate, and more survivors to help. Despite the unrelenting pain of losing her daughter, Clara continued to stand tall. She was driven by the love she had for Jennifer, by the desire to ensure that her daughter's life was remembered not as a tragedy, but as a turning point in the fight against domestic violence. And as long as she breathed, Clara would make sure that Jennifer's story was told. She would make sure that every person who had been affected by emotional abuse, by the kind of manipulation and control that Derek Medina had exercised over Jennifer, would have a voice. As the foundation grew and more survivors came forward with their stories, the ripple effect of Jennifer's death continued to spread. The fight for change was far from over, but the difference Jennifer's family had made was undeniable. They had sparked a movement that was helping people break free from the chains of emotional abuse and regain control of their lives. And in that, Jennifer's life, her spirit, her courage, would continue to touch the lives of countless others for years to come. Through her death, Jennifer Alfonso had become a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of hope and change. Her family's grief had been transformed into a beacon for those who had been silenced, for those who had suffered in the shadows, for those who had been unable to escape. And through their efforts, Jennifer's legacy would live on, long after the courtroom drama had ended and the media had moved on. Jennifer's story would continue to save lives, and in doing so, her memory would never fade. As Jennifer Alfonso's story became a beacon for survivors of domestic violence, a deeper question began to emerge. What more could be done to prevent tragedies like hers from occurring? While the advocacy and awareness efforts that Jennifer's family had tirelessly worked toward were making a significant impact, the conversation about domestic violence continued to evolve. The long-term emotional scars, the psychological abuse, the isolation, these aspects of domestic abuse were often overlooked or minimized in the legal and public discourse, despite the overwhelming evidence that they were just as dangerous as physical violence. Clara Alfonso, Jennifer's mother, and the friends who had shared Jennifer's life before her marriage to Derek Medina continued to carry the weight of their loss. For them, the work wasn't just about advocacy, it was about justice. It was about making sure that the cycle of emotional abuse, which had silently claimed Jennifer's life, was acknowledged and addressed on a larger scale. Derek Medina had not only killed Jennifer physically, he had destroyed her mentally and emotionally over the course of their marriage, until she no longer believed she could escape. This was the message that Clara continued to share with anyone who would listen. In countless speeches, interviews, and meetings with legislators, Clara urged them to understand that emotional abuse was not just a relationship issue. It was a public issue. It affected entire communities. It was a form of violence that, when left unchecked, could escalate to murder. In the wake of Jennifer's death, Clara had become a tireless advocate for more comprehensive laws that protected victims of emotional and psychological abuse. She fought for changes in the legal system that would prevent another woman from being trapped in a relationship like Jennifer's. One of the most important victories of their advocacy came when a new law was passed in Florida, named in part for Jennifer, that required the inclusion of emotional and psychological abuse in the legal definitions of domestic violence. It was a hard-fought victory that had been years in the making, and it didn't come without significant pushback from those who viewed it as unnecessary or overly broad. But for Clara and Jennifer's friends, it was a sign that their daughter's death had not been in vain. With the law in place, survivors of emotional abuse were now able to seek legal protection from their abusers. The new legislation provided a clearer path for victims to file for restraining orders, and it made it easier for law enforcement to recognize the signs of emotional abuse in their investigations. While it would never undo the damage done to Jennifer, it was a step in the right direction, a step toward creating a society where emotional abuse was taken as seriously as physical violence. But the question of Derek Medina's punishment still loomed over Jennifer's family. The legal system had convicted him of second-degree murder, and he was serving his time in prison. But Jennifer's family, and many who had followed the case, felt that the punishment was inadequate. A 25-year sentence for a crime that had taken Jennifer's life seemed insufficient. Many felt that Derek's lack of remorse, his refusal to acknowledge the gravity of his crime, and the cold detachment with which he had approached his wife's death made him unworthy of such a relatively light sentence. The thought that Derek would one day be released from prison, walking freely while Jennifer's family continued to live with the aftermath of his crime, was a constant source of anxiety. Jennifer's mother, Clara, would often reflect on the fact that nothing could ever bring Jennifer back, but that justice had to be served. Not just for her, but for all those who had suffered in silence, for all the women and children who had been victims of emotional and physical abuse. As Derek Medina served his sentence, a growing movement emerged to address the larger issue of prison reform. The criminal justice system, as it stood, often failed to address the root causes of violent crime, focusing more on punitive measures than on rehabilitation. While Derek Medina's actions could never be excused, some advocates for prison reform began to ask, what could be done to prevent more men from becoming like him? What could society do to break the cycle of violence, to prevent emotional abuse from escalating into murder? Clara and Jennifer's friends, though grieving, recognized the complexity of the situation. They acknowledged that while Derek deserved punishment for what he had done, the broader problem lay in the society's failure to recognize the signs of abuse before it turned deadly. The movement they had started was not just about punishing abusers, but about providing resources for those at risk and educating the public about the insidious nature of emotional and psychological manipulation. One of the most significant strides in this movement came when Jennifer's foundation partnered with local schools to provide education on healthy relationships, emotional boundaries, and the dangers of controlling behavior. The foundation worked with educators to create curricula that addressed the warning signs of emotional abuse in a way that was age-appropriate, helping young people recognize unhealthy patterns before they could become entrenched in their own relationships. For Jennifer's family, the foundation's success was bittersweet. They had built something meaningful out of their grief, something that would continue to help people for years to come. But there was still a deep sadness that could not be erased, a longing for the daughter and sister they had lost. Jennifer had been a bright light in their lives, and though her memory had inspired countless others, it was hard to reconcile that with the empty space she had left behind. As Jennifer's story continued to make waves in the world of domestic violence advocacy, the media began to take a deeper look at the societal issues that had contributed to her tragic death. The conversation shifted from being solely about the crime itself to a more comprehensive discussion about the long-term effects of emotional and psychological abuse. Domestic violence was no longer just a story about physical violence. It was about control, manipulation, and the toll that emotional abuse took on the victim. Despite the pain that still lingered, Jennifer's family took comfort in knowing that their work was part of a much larger movement. A movement that was changing the way society viewed domestic abuse and the cycle of violence. They hoped that their efforts would help bring about a future where people like Jennifer would no longer be trapped in dangerous relationships, where the signs of emotional abuse would be recognized and acted upon before it was too late. For Clara, Maria, and the other survivors of emotional abuse who had been touched by Jennifer's story, there was no easy answer to the question of why Jennifer had to die. But they had come to realize that Jennifer's death had sparked something much greater than they had ever imagined. A movement for justice, for change, and for the protection of those who could not protect themselves. Jennifer's story, painful and tragic as it was, had become a catalyst for awareness, healing, and ultimately transformation. Derek Medina's life, on the other hand, had been defined by his actions. He had spent years trying to justify what he had done, to convince others that Jennifer's death was somehow her fault. But in the end, the truth was undeniable. Jennifer had been a victim of his control, his manipulation, and his violence, and no amount of time in prison could ever change that. The foundation that had been built in Jennifer's name, the laws that had been passed, and the awareness that had been raised were all powerful testaments to the strength and resilience of those who had loved her. And through it all, Jennifer's memory continued to live on, not as a victim, but as a symbol of the fight for justice, for love, and for the right to live without fear. Her legacy was a reminder that every life matters, and that no one should have to endure the kind of pain Jennifer had suffered. It was a legacy that would continue to grow, to change lives, and to ensure that her story, her life, was never forgotten. As the foundation continued to gain traction, Clara Alfonso and Jennifer's closest friends began to see the real-world impact of their efforts. Survivors reached out to them, grateful for the resources and support that had once been unavailable to them. The toll of years of silence, of invisible wounds, was finally beginning to be acknowledged. More and more women began to speak up about their own experiences with emotional abuse. And while the path to healing was long and painful, they no longer felt as if they were alone in their struggles. Jennifer's name had, in many ways, become synonymous with the recognition of emotional abuse as a legitimate form of violence. Her family and friends had made it clear that her death was not just the result of a tragic argument gone wrong, but the outcome of years of psychological manipulation, control, and gaslighting. It was a story that had sparked a revolution in how emotional and psychological abuse were understood by society, the justice system, and survivors themselves. Jennifer's case became a focal point in numerous discussions about domestic violence, prevention, and education. Her family worked tirelessly with lawmakers and advocates to implement domestic violence education in schools, teaching children not only about physical abuse, but also about the insidious nature of emotional control. The foundation also expanded its reach, helping hundreds of women navigate the legal system, obtain restraining orders, and, perhaps most importantly, regain their self-worth. They were no longer simply victims. They were survivors, each one learning to reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them by an abuser's power. But for Clara and her friends, while the advocacy work brought a sense of purpose and progress, it didn't take away the pain of losing Jennifer. Clara would often speak about the difficulty of reconciling her mission with her grief. "I wake up every day and I fight for her," Clara said, her voice breaking. "But that doesn't mean the pain goes away. It never goes away. I do this because I have to, because she would want me to. But I still miss her every second of every day." The emotional and psychological toll of losing a child is something that can never fully be understood unless experienced. Clara had lost not only her daughter, but her hopes for the future, the milestones they would never share, the dreams that would never be realized. Jennifer had been a young woman with so much life left to live, so much potential, and yet her life had been stolen away by a man who had promised her everything and delivered only destruction. Clara's grief had always been palpable, but it was now channeled into action. The foundation had been instrumental in raising awareness about the cycle of abuse, but it also served as a refuge for those in the midst of their own struggles. Women who reached out to the foundation spoke of their own nightmares, their own stories of control, gaslighting, and emotional torment. They saw Jennifer's story in their own lives, and they saw the possibility of change. For the first time, they saw a glimmer of hope. Maria, Jennifer's best friend, continued to be an integral part of the foundation. While she too had struggled with grief, she had found comfort in helping others. It was in the shared stories, the shared experiences, that Maria found a sense of healing. "I couldn't save Jennifer," Maria would say quietly, "but I can help others. I can make sure no one has to go through what she did. I can't bring her back, but I can make sure her story saves someone else." And so as Clara and Jennifer's friends worked to build the foundation into a lifeline for other women, the impact of Jennifer's death began to spread. Local lawmakers were influenced by the stories that Jennifer's family shared, pushing for stronger laws and greater resources for survivors of domestic abuse. The foundation's message began to gain traction in the media as well. The more people heard Jennifer's story, the more they understood the devastating impact that emotional and psychological abuse had on victims. But even as Jennifer's story began to resonate with larger audiences, there remained a dark personal question that lingered for Clara and her family. What had driven Derek Medina to kill Jennifer? How could someone who claimed to love her, who had shared years of his life with her, end it all so violently and without remorse? The questions never truly stopped. The criminal justice system had served its purpose by convicting Derek Medina of second-degree murder, but for Clara and the others, it felt like an incomplete justice. Derek had never truly been held accountable for the years of emotional torment he had inflicted on Jennifer. He had manipulated her into believing that she was nothing without him, that she would never be able to survive without his control. He had stripped her of her agency, her self-esteem, and her sense of self-worth. And yet, despite his conviction, he continued to deny responsibility for his actions. He maintained that Jennifer's betrayal had forced him to act, refusing to acknowledge that it was his own deep-seated need for control that had led to her death. It was this denial, this refusal to acknowledge the damage he had caused, that made Jennifer's family and friends feel as though justice had not truly been served. The impact of emotional abuse could never be truly measured in a courtroom. No legal system could restore the years that Derek had taken from Jennifer, or from the countless others who had suffered under his control. The work that Jennifer's family had done in her memory, raising awareness, advocating for legal reform, helping other survivors, was their way of continuing the fight. But the question of Derek's true culpability would never be fully answered. In the months after the trial, Jennifer's family continued to feel the weight of the legal system's limitations. They knew that no matter how many laws they passed, no matter how much they advocated for change, it would never bring Jennifer back. The foundation provided them with a sense of purpose, but it didn't erase the hole that Jennifer's absence had left in their lives. They wanted her back. They wanted to hold her again, to hear her laugh, to watch her grow and thrive. But that was no longer possible. Despite their grief, Jennifer's family was determined to keep her memory alive in the best way they knew how, by helping others, by giving a voice to the voiceless, and by making sure that the story of Jennifer's life and death would not be forgotten. As they continued their work, they often reflected on the lessons they had learned from Jennifer's story, the importance of recognizing the signs of emotional abuse, the necessity of speaking out, and the need for greater support for survivors. Jennifer's story had changed the way people thought about domestic violence, but it had also changed the way people thought about love, control, and self-worth. It had shown the world that emotional abuse could be just as devastating as physical violence, and that no one should have to suffer in silence. Through their grief, Jennifer's family had found a way to make her death matter. They had ensured that her story would be shared with the world, that her memory would inspire change, and that her legacy would be one of hope for the future. Jennifer may have been taken from them far too soon, but her story was far from over. It would continue to save lives, to change minds, and to inspire others to stand up against the kind of control and manipulation that had ultimately taken her from them. In the end, Jennifer Alfonso was more than just a victim. She was a symbol of strength, a beacon for those trapped in abusive relationships, and a reminder that no matter how dark the journey may seem, there is always a way out, and there is always hope. As the years went by, the conversation around Jennifer Alfonso's death shifted from a personal tragedy to a wider cultural reckoning. Jennifer's family, especially Clara, her mother, continued to work tirelessly to keep her memory alive, to spread awareness about the silent epidemic of emotional and psychological abuse, and to ensure that no other woman would ever have to suffer in the same way. Through the work of the foundation they had established in her name, Jennifer's death had become more than just a story of loss. It had become a tool for change. But even with the progress they had made, there were moments when the pain of losing Jennifer was overwhelming. For Clara, the weight of her daughter's absence was a constant burden. Though she had found a sense of purpose in her advocacy work, the grief never truly dissipated. There were still days when Clara would find herself alone in her thoughts, wishing she could turn back time and do more for Jennifer. She often reflected on how her daughter's life had been snatched away too soon, the potential that had been erased in a single, violent moment. Yet through the grief, Clara had become a beacon of hope for others. Her story, intertwined with Jennifer's, resonated deeply with women and men alike who had experienced similar abuses. Jennifer's story, told through Clara's voice, had become a way for survivors to find their own voice, to share their pain, and to recognize that they were not alone. The message was clear: emotional and psychological abuse could no longer be ignored. It could no longer be brushed aside as part of a normal relationship. It was just as dangerous, just as damaging as physical violence. The foundation, while still focusing on immediate support for victims, shifted its efforts to a more proactive role. The realization that emotional abuse often precedes physical violence and that intervention before the violence escalates is crucial, led the foundation to work closely with schools, community organizations, and public health institutions. They created educational materials and workshops to teach the signs of emotional abuse to children, teenagers, and young adults before they found themselves in toxic relationships. Their outreach expanded, not just to the immediate community, but nationwide, as their message resonated more with people who had, for too long, suffered in silence. Clara spoke at schools, talking to teenagers about the importance of healthy relationships. She spoke of Jennifer's life, not just her tragic death, but of who she had been before the emotional abuse had begun. Clara wanted people to understand that Jennifer wasn't just a victim, but a vibrant, hopeful woman who had been robbed of her future by someone who had promised to love her. Through her advocacy, she began to rebuild Jennifer's life, not in the conventional sense, but in a way that honored her daughter's memory and her right to be remembered as more than just a casualty of domestic violence. Jennifer's friends, too, played an integral role in keeping her story alive. Maria, who had been Jennifer's confidant, took on a leadership role within the foundation. She used her pain, her memories, and her understanding of the depth of Jennifer's suffering to help others. Maria knew firsthand how hard it was to see someone you love trapped in a cycle of abuse. She had seen the slow, creeping changes in Jennifer, how her once bright and outgoing personality had been dulled by Derek's manipulation. Maria felt that her efforts to continue Jennifer's work were a way to atone for her own feelings of helplessness in the face of what had happened. In the years following Jennifer's death, there were other high-profile cases of domestic violence that caught the public's attention, but few were as widely discussed as Jennifer's. The discussion of emotional abuse had grown in prominence, largely thanks to the work of Clara and the foundation, but the fight for proper legal recognition was far from over. Even as Jennifer's family made strides in advocacy and awareness, they faced resistance. Some still believed that emotional abuse was too ambiguous, too hard to define legally. Others argued that it was difficult to prosecute someone for emotional abuse when there were no clear, visible signs. But Jennifer's family, fueled by their love for her and their desire for justice, pushed forward, determined to change the law. Clara's voice had become one of authority in the domestic violence community. Her tireless pursuit of justice and change had made her a respected figure. But behind the calm demeanor she projected in public, there was still a mother who missed her daughter terribly. The annual anniversaries of Jennifer's death were especially difficult. Though she had managed to turn her grief into action, the pain of her daughter's absence never faded. Every anniversary was a reminder of what had been taken. Every milestone Jennifer would never reach, graduations, marriages, children of her own, was a painful reminder that her life had been cut short by violence. Yet there were moments when Clara found peace in the small victories. She often spoke of the women and children who reached out to the foundation, sharing their own stories of survival. For Clara, these women became a source of strength. They were living proof that Jennifer's story was making a difference, that her death had sparked something meaningful in the world. Jennifer's family had turned their grief into a movement, one that was helping survivors rebuild their lives and raising awareness about the lasting effects of emotional and psychological abuse. In prison, Derek Medina continued to serve his sentence. His arrogance, his complete lack of remorse, and his inability to understand the full weight of his actions remained unchanged. The years he spent behind bars did little to change the man he was when he murdered Jennifer. His story, unlike Jennifer's, was not one of resilience or redemption. It was the story of a man who had taken everything from someone else, and in the process had destroyed not just their life, but the lives of everyone who loved them. Jennifer's family, especially Clara, remained focused on the future. They knew that while the system had convicted Derek Medina, there was still much work to be done. The broader fight against domestic violence continued, with many battles still to be won. One of the key issues remained the recognition of emotional abuse in the legal system. There was still a long way to go before every victim could seek justice, before every survivor could be empowered to leave abusive relationships without fearing they would be blamed. But Clara knew that their work, their efforts, were making a difference. Jennifer's story had become a platform for change, and through it, they had already changed so many lives. Jennifer's legacy was no longer one of a young woman lost too soon. It was a legacy of hope, of resilience, and of the fight for justice that would never be forgotten. Jennifer's family's mission had not just been to honor her memory. It was to ensure that no one else had to endure what she had gone through. It was to ensure that, even in death, Jennifer's life had a lasting purpose, one that would continue to inspire, to educate, and to save lives. And through that, Jennifer's memory lived on, not as a victim, but as a symbol of strength and survival. She had, in the end, become the very thing Derek had tried to strip away from her: a voice for the voiceless, a voice for all those who had suffered in silence, a voice that would echo for generations to come, speaking of love, loss, and the power of change. As Clara Alfonso's advocacy continued to gain momentum, it became clear that the death of her daughter, Jennifer, was no longer just a story of tragedy. It was the driving force behind a larger movement, one that sought to address the invisible wounds caused by emotional and psychological abuse. Jennifer's death, while devastating, had sparked a national conversation, one that was long overdue, about the impact of emotional abuse and the need for societal change. Clara and Jennifer's close friends worked tirelessly to ensure that Jennifer's memory lived on, not just as a victim, but as a beacon for those suffering in silence. The foundation they created in Jennifer's name became a source of hope for survivors, offering counseling, legal support, and a safe space for those who had endured similar abuse. But even more importantly, it became a platform for educating the public about the dangers of emotional manipulation, control, and isolation, the very tactics that had ultimately led to Jennifer's death. Despite the ongoing grief, Clara found a renewed sense of purpose in this work. She had lost her daughter, but through her advocacy, Jennifer's story had the power to save others. As Clara spoke at conferences, met with lawmakers, and rallied for stronger protections for victims of emotional abuse, she found solace in knowing that Jennifer's legacy was making a difference. The foundation had helped countless survivors regain their sense of self-worth, their independence, and their ability to rebuild their lives. But as much as Clara threw herself into her work, the pain of losing Jennifer never truly went away. There were moments when Clara would visit Jennifer's grave, sit in silence, and reflect on all the dreams that had been cut short. Jennifer had been so full of life, her smile, her laughter, her kindness. And yet she had been silenced by the very person who was supposed to protect her. The grief would come in waves, washing over her unexpectedly. Even as Clara worked tirelessly to make sure her daughter's death was not in vain, the absence of Jennifer was something that could never be filled. It was during these quiet moments of reflection that Clara realized the true depth of the trauma Jennifer had endured. Emotional abuse, Clara came to understand, was not just something that happened in isolated incidents. It was a pattern. It was a slow erosion of the victim's sense of self, their confidence, their will to fight back. It was the manipulation of love, the twisting of reality, until the victim no longer knew where they ended and their abuser began. And by the time Jennifer had tried to leave Derek, the damage had already been done. She had been broken down, piece by piece, over the course of their marriage, until she no longer believed she could escape. Jennifer had tried to break free multiple times, but each time Derek's manipulation pulled her back. He would beg, he would promise to change, and each time Jennifer returned, hoping that their relationship could be repaired. She had loved him. She had believed in him. But in the end, it was his need for control that had destroyed everything. And it was this heartbreaking reality that Clara felt compelled to share with others. She wanted people to understand that emotional abuse was not something that could be easily brushed aside or misunderstood. It was a form of violence that left invisible scars, scars that could last a lifetime. Jennifer's case had brought the issue of emotional abuse into the national spotlight. But despite the progress made, the legal system still struggled to recognize the full scope of emotional abuse. While physical violence could be documented with bruises and wounds, emotional and psychological abuse often went unnoticed. Many victims of emotional abuse remained silent because they didn't have the words to describe what they were experiencing or because they didn't know where to turn for help. There was still a stigma surrounding emotional abuse. Many people didn't take it seriously, or they believed it wasn't as harmful as physical violence. But Clara knew that this was a battle worth fighting. She understood that the road to change would be long, but she was committed to making sure that Jennifer's death was not in vain. Through the foundation, Clara worked to educate law enforcement, legal professionals, and communities about the importance of recognizing and addressing emotional abuse. She worked closely with domestic violence shelters, helping to train staff on how to identify the signs of emotional abuse in addition to physical violence. And slowly, the conversation began to change. More people were becoming aware of the dangers of emotional abuse. More people were speaking out. As time passed, Jennifer's family continued to advocate for stronger laws and greater support for survivors. But Clara remained haunted by the thought that Derek would one day be released from prison. He was serving a 25-year sentence. But for Jennifer's family, this was not enough. It never would be. No sentence could ever bring Jennifer back. No amount of time behind bars could erase the fact that a bright, promising life had been taken too soon. And while Clara had come to terms with the fact that she could not change the past, she refused to let the future be defined by Derek's cruelty. For Jennifer's friends, the foundation became a living testament to her life. They kept her memory alive through their advocacy, and as they spoke to other survivors, they shared Jennifer's story. They shared her laughter, her kindness, and her spirit. They reminded others that Jennifer was not just a victim. She was a woman with dreams, with aspirations, with a life to live. And in this way, Jennifer's story continued to inspire others to fight back, to speak out, and to reclaim their own life.